Angela Lee was the face of Asian MMA, a rising star, a champion at just 19. She seemed unstoppable, undefeated, marketable, and destined to dominate one championship for years. But what fans saw in the cage wasn't the full story. Behind the gloves, Angela was breaking, silently. In 2017, the unthinkable happened. She crashed her car at high speed, and at first, it was called an accident. But years later, Angela revealed the horrifying truth. It wasn't an accident. It was a suicide attempt. And now, she's speaking out. Not just about her pain, but about the hidden darkness inside MMA, the pressure to be perfect, the identity crisis, the mental toll no one talks about. This is the story of Angela Lee, the fighter who almost didn't survive the fight outside the ring. Angela Lee didn't just grow up around martial arts. She was raised in it. Born in Vancouver and raised in Hawaii, she was the product of two seasoned fighters. Her father, Ken Lee, a skilled martial artist and coach, and her mother, Jules Lee, a black belt herself. Martial arts wasn't just something they taught. It was the family's entire philosophy. And from the moment Angela could walk, she was expected to follow suit. By age 6, she was already training seriously. Her early memories weren't of dolls or cartoons, but of stretching mats, focus drills, and controlled sparring with her younger siblings. The Lee household was a dojo. Their dinner conversations revolved around fight strategy. Their vacations involved tournament. Even birthdays came with new belts or gear. There was love, but also pressure. The kind that quietly tells a child, this is who you're supposed to be. Angela's rise didn't come from nowhere. It was engineered. Every day, she was shaped by routines most adults couldn't handle. Wake up, train, school, back to training, nutrition plan, conditioning drills, visualization techniques, all while her friends were living normal teenage lives. Her childhood was spent under the intense gaze of discipline and expectation. Her brother, Christian Lee, was also a prodigy. Her younger sister, Victoria Lee, would later become another. But Angela was the first to carry the weight of the family's legacy on her shoulders. Her parents weren't just pushing her toward greatness, they were crafting a dynasty, and Angela was expected to lead it. What no one knew at the time was that this foundation, as disciplined and loving as it may have seemed, would later become a cage of its own. A structure so rigid, so high pressure, that when cracks started to form, there was no room to escape. Angela never got to ask herself what she wanted outside of fighting. She was told what she was, a champion in the making. And in the world she grew up in, being anything less wasn't just disappointing, it was unthinkable. Angela Lee didn't waste any time proving her worth. At just 18 years old, she signed with One Championship, Asia's premier MMA organization. The promotion saw in her the perfect storm. Young, talented, half Asian, half Caucasian, fluent in both English and martial arts media hype. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a brand. In May 2016, at only 19 years old, Angela fought veteran Mai Yamaguchi for the inaugural one atomweight world title. It was a war, 5 grueling rounds that pushed both women to their limits. Angela emerged victorious, making history as the youngest world champion in MMA history. The crowd erupted. The internet lit up. One Championship had its superstar. The promotion wrapped itself around her. Unstoppable became her slogan. Highlight reels showcased her flashy submissions. Every poster, trailer, and countdown show featured her glowing face. She was the embodiment of a new generation, strong, respectful, and marketable. A clean-cut alternative to the chaos of American MMA. And for a while, Angela embraced it. She said all the right things, smiled through every interview, wore the pressure like armor. But even then, the signs of strain were surfacing. She was defending her title, sure, but behind the scenes, she was also juggling school, injuries, family obligations, and endless media appearances. There was no off-season, no downtime, and no room for vulnerability. What fans didn't see was how hard it was becoming for Angela to maintain the image. Every win brought more expectation. Every title defense raised the stakes. There was no such thing as just being herself. She had to be unstoppable. Every day, all the time. Any hint of fear or fatigue was buried deep, never to be shown. Angela began to experience what many fighters do but rarely talk about: the quiet erosion of identity. Outside the cage, who was she? Really? Was she allowed to have doubt, to feel weak, to want something other than what she'd been trained for since childhood? Those questions lingered, unanswered, and the more she ignored them, the louder they got. By the time Angela Lee had successfully defended her title multiple times, she was hailed as a role model across Asia and beyond. But inside, something was cracking. The smiling champion on posters and in promos was beginning to feel like a mask. And keeping it on became the hardest part of the job. Angela's life was scheduled to the minute. Train, eat, rest, promote, repeat. She wasn't just living a fighter's life. She was living a brand's life. And behind every smiling post on Instagram was a mounting storm of burnout, body pain, and emotional exhaustion. She admitted later that she struggled with self-worth outside the cage. When she wasn't fighting, she felt aimless. When she wasn't training, she felt guilty. Even small moments of rest were haunted by the thought, you're falling behind, someone's coming for your belt. Her entire identity was wrapped around being a champion, and the fear of losing that title, not just physically, but symbolically, became unbearable. Then came the weight cuts. Like many fighters, Angela had to cut significant weight to make atom weight. But in her case, the pressure to look good, feel strong, and hit a number, all while performing flawlessly, pushed her body to the edge. She started to experience fainting spells. Her mood plummeted. She felt constantly fatigued, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Champions don't make excuses. Publicly, her career looked unstoppable, but privately, her confidence was evaporating. Angela would later say that she began experiencing depressive episodes, moments of emotional numbness that scared her. She didn't talk about it with her team. She didn't tell her fans. She feared being seen as weak. And in the culture of MMA, especially in Asia, there was no space for mental health conversations. She began to question everything. Was she fighting for herself or for others? Was this even what she wanted? Could she ever be normal again? Angela didn't have answers, and in November 2017, that silence nearly killed her. It was November 6, 2017. News broke that Angela Lee had been in a serious car accident on her way to morning training in Hawaii. The headlines said she had fallen asleep at the wheel. Her car veered off the highway, flipped several times, and was nearly unrecognizable when emergency responders arrived. Miraculously, Angela survived. The promotion called it a close call. Fans assumed it was a tragic but random accident. They said she had simply pushed herself too hard. She needed rest. A fight was canceled. Her family stayed quiet, and so did she. But behind the scenes, no one was really asking questions. Everyone accepted the surface-level story because it was easier than the truth. Angela's bruises faded. She returned to training. She fought again, and the narrative was sealed. She was a warrior who came back from disaster. The unstoppable spirit lived on. But that story was fiction. What Angela never said publicly, not for 6 more years, was that the crash wasn't accidental. She hadn't just fallen asleep. She had made the decision to end her life. Years later, she would recount the moment in chilling detail. The pressure of being the face of an organization, the emotional collapse that had built up behind her smile, the crushing feeling that she was trapped in a role she couldn't escape from. That morning, she got in the car, knowing what she was about to do. She believed the only way out was to crash, to vanish quietly, to make it all look like fate. She didn't plan on surviving. When the car tumbled off the road and landed mangled, Angela lived, but a part of her didn't. The mask she had worn so confidently was fractured, and in the weeks and months that followed, she didn't tell the world what really happened. She wasn't ready. In MMA, fighters are rewarded for surviving trauma, but they're punished for admitting pain. Angela did what many fighters do. She buried it. She healed the bones, not the mind. She returned to her title reign, and no one ever suspected that she had almost died by choice, until 2023, when Angela finally broke the silence. For years, Angela Lee wore the mask. She smiled for photos. She kept training. She kept winning. But something had changed after the crash. A quiet awareness that everything was fragile, that she'd almost ended everything, and no one knew the truth. In September 2023, that changed. Angela published an open letter with the Players Tribune, a raw and haunting essay titled Dear Victoria. It was addressed to her late sister, but really, it was a letter to herself and to everyone who ever silently suffered under the weight of perfection. In the letter, she wrote, "In 2017, I tried to end my life." She didn't hide behind euphemisms. She called it what it was, a suicide attempt. She admitted that she had intentionally crashed her car, not out of recklessness, but despair, not out of weakness, but exhaustion. She explained that she felt like a prisoner inside her own life, that everything, her identity, her self-worth, her future, had been hijacked by a machine she couldn't slow down. She confessed that no one knew what she was going through, not even her closest friends. She was the perfect fighter, the smiling champion. How could she not be okay? Her admission hit the MMA world like a tidal wave. Fans who had idolized her for her toughness now saw her through a different lens. It wasn't her fights that defined her anymore, it was her survival. Fighters around the world, especially women, began to speak up. They echoed her pain, her silence, her fear. Angela had pulled the curtain back on something the sport rarely acknowledges, that the mental toll of MMA is just as brutal as the physical. The camps, the weight cuts, the injuries, the public scrutiny, the identity collapse. It's not just about winning or losing, it's about who you become when you can no longer tell the difference between the fighter and the person. Angela had survived the most dangerous opponent of all, herself, and now she was ready to fight for something far more important than belts. Angela Lee's story wasn't just about her, it was a mirror held up to an entire sport. When she revealed the truth about her suicide attempt, it forced a brutal question into the spotlight. How many other fighters are barely holding on? For decades, MMA celebrated toughness above all. Broken noses, torn ligaments, concussions. Wear them like badges of honor. Fighters were supposed to be machines. Emotions were weaknesses. Depression, anxiety, burnout. That was for people who didn't have heart. Angela shattered that myth. In interviews and speeches following her reveal, she described the culture as emotionally bankrupt. Fighters are trained to suppress, to survive, to shut down any inner voice that says, "This hurts too much." And when the lights go out and the fans stop cheering, too many fighters are left with nothing but silence and no tools to process it. Angela said she had learned to ignore her emotions because showing them meant being seen as soft. She was never taught to cope, only to push. And that cycle is repeated in gyms around the world. Coaches push, teams expect, promotions demand, and fighters are told to tough it out until they break. Her words inspired others to come forward. Retired fighters began sharing stories of post-fight depression. Some admitted to near-death experiences. Some quietly mentioned therapy for the first time. Others simply said, "Thank you for saying what we couldn't." But Angela didn't stop at speaking. She took action. She launched Fight Story, a mental health initiative to give fighters and athletes a place to share their struggles without shame. It offered resources, outreach, and most importantly, a voice. The same voice Angela never had in 2017. MMA is still catching up. Promotions still treat emotional pain like a footnote, but Angela Lee made it impossible to ignore. Her story isn't just a warning, it's a call to action. Because if the strongest among us can feel that broken, then maybe strength isn't what we thought it was. On December 26, 2022, tragedy struck the Lee family again. Angela's youngest sister, Victoria Lee, was found dead. She was only 18. The cause of death wasn't announced at first. Fans speculated, but the family remained silent. The MMA world mourned a bright young star gone far too soon. Victoria had been undefeated, beautiful, talented, soft-spoken. She was the next chapter in the Lee dynasty. But underneath that promising image, there was something darker. Months later, the truth came out. Victoria had died by suicide. Angela, in her letter to the Players Tribune, revealed what had truly happened. She wrote that her sister had suffered silently, just as she had. The same pressure, the same expectations, the same weight of legacy. Victoria had trained with the same coaches, followed the same path, and faced the same unrelenting pace Angela once did. But Victoria didn't survive it. Angela's grief was unimaginable. Not only had she lost her baby sister, she had lost a mirror of herself, and with that loss came guilt. Could she have stopped it? Could she have said something sooner? Could she have shared her own story earlier and changed the course? Angela called Victoria the most beautiful soul I've ever known. But now, that soul was gone, and Angela couldn't run from the truth anymore. The culture they had been raised in, the machine of martial arts glory, pressure, and silence, had taken something from both of them. Angela had survived by inches. Victoria didn't. For the first time, Angela allowed herself to feel all the things she had spent years burying: rage, sorrow, emptiness. She could no longer perform, no longer compete, no longer pretend. Victoria's death became a turning point. Angela realized that being a champion didn't matter if it cost people their lives. What mattered now was healing. And maybe, just maybe, helping others escape the same silent pain that had haunted her sister. In September 2023, less than a year after Victoria's death and nearly 6 years after her own suicide attempt, Angela Lee made it official. She announced her retirement from MMA during One Championship's Fight Night 14 in a deeply emotional appearance that left fans stunned and speechless. Standing in the center of the cage she once ruled, Angela removed the atomweight title belt and placed it in the middle of the canvas. She didn't need it anymore. Not because she couldn't fight, but because she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but her message was clear. Fighting saved her life once, but now, stepping away was what would save it again. Angela spoke about her sister, about her own mental health, about the pain of pretending to be unstoppable when, in truth, she was barely holding on. "I've cried more in the past year than I ever thought possible," she said. "But I've also learned more about myself than I ever did as a fighter." For Angela, retirement wasn't weakness, it was liberation. She said that for years she'd felt like MMA was the only thing that made her matter. But losing Victoria, and finally being honest about her own trauma, had revealed something deeper. Her life wasn't supposed to be defined by wins or belts. It was meant to be something more human. Angela stepped away from the sport on her own terms. No scandals, no injuries, no humiliating losses, just a quiet, heartbreaking truth. She didn't want to wear the mask anymore. She didn't want to smile for cameras when her heart was broken. She didn't want to perform. She wanted to be real. And for the first time, the MMA world didn't see Angela as a fighter. They saw her as a survivor, a sister, a mother, a woman brave enough to walk away before it destroyed her for good. Angela Lee could have disappeared. She could have walked away from MMA and never looked back. No one would have blamed her. But she didn't. Instead, she did something that no world champion before her had done. She turned her pain into purpose. She founded Fight Story, a non-profit organization focused on mental health in combat sports. It wasn't just a vanity project. It was built from the ashes of her own story and her sister's. Angela said the name came from the realization that everyone has a fight, whether it's in a cage or in their own mind. Fight Story became a place where fighters, athletes, and anyone struggling with pressure and identity could share their stories without fear. She began traveling, speaking, writing, not about technique or titles, but about depression, suicidal thoughts, and emotional survival. Her speeches hit hard. They weren't motivational fluff. They were raw, unfiltered reflections from someone who had stood at the edge of death and turned back. She talked about the lies fighters tell themselves, the fear of being vulnerable, the silent dread of disappointing everyone around you, and how pretending to be okay can kill you faster than any punch ever will. Angela's transformation wasn't perfect. She still struggles. She still grieves, but now she's using that grief as fuel. She doesn't train to fight opponents anymore. She trains to help others fight demons they can't see. Through Fight Story, she's built a new kind of legacy, not based on wins, but on truth. Angela Lee will always be remembered as the youngest MMA world champion, but now she's something far more rare, a fighter who walked away and chose to live. And that, in the end, may be her greatest victory.